Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by quickly introducing the panelists, and then I'm going to let them do a little bit more introduction about themselves and open up the discussion about the legal implications of technology use for law enforcement. So let's get started, I guess. So here we have Scott Holmes, who's a criminal defense attorney in the area with a lot of experience on these topics. We have Christopher Brook, who is the legal director of the ACLU of North Carolina. Professor Miller, who teaches civil procedure and civil rights litigation here at Duke, and Professor Griffin, who teaches evidence and criminal procedure. So if you wouldn't mind sort of introducing yourselves a bit further, talking about your interests in the area, any experience that you might have, and then take the discussion from there wherever you feel that it is, best, wherever it leads you. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Scott Holmes. I have been practicing for about 16 years, primarily in Durham, but I also have done federal work, basically from Winston-Salem to Wilmington. I've done trial work and appellate work in the state and federal courts. I've done some Section 1983 litigation. I'm currently professor of law at North Carolina Central University, the other law school here. I teach criminal procedure, app-ad, trial ad, and supervise our civil litigation clinic. And in our clinic, we have some cases that involve police misconduct. And what I have felt led to share is one of the cases that came through came through my private practice and a little bit into my clinic. It's the case of John Hill. I've got a little 5-minute video that I'll play, but to set it up, it illustrates a little bit about how video can be important for both criminal defense and civil litigation. John, you'll see, is a disabled guy. He's now a friend of mine. We kind of hang out a little bit on the weekends. He was riding his bike on a part of Durham where has more police surveillance than y'all have over here. And the officers saw John enter into a red light, an intersection where the light was still red, but saw that it turned green just as he entered the intersection. And then stopped him for running a red light on his bicycle. After Mr. Hill was kind of frustrated about that because he was just trying to get to work and it was actually green when he went through the light. And so what you'll see in the video is the video begins, the officer's already out of his vehicle, which is a problem because the way this video is supposed to work is that it's supposed to record and permanently record prior to when the incident occurs so that you get the minutes leading up to the incident in addition to the incident. So some defect happened and it didn't get the video, probably the part that showed the light turning green. It's not in the video. Another problem with this is that the officer did not put on his microphone when he got out. So this was a dash cam in his video, in his car. So you get out and you have no sound. You can hear the sound inside the car, but that's not real helpful to figure out what the folks are saying. Well, having tried this case in district court and worked on it, I kind of know what was being said. John was yelling and screaming about why are you stopping me when what light was green? And the officer points and it says, well, this is being recorded. And I think he's pointing that out because he senses John's angry and is trying to let him know you're on video, smile, you're on candid camera. But the way John interpreted that was, well, great, if it's on video, let's go look at it and you'll see the light was green and you can let me get on to work. The officer starts yelling at John to sit down. John doesn't sit down, and then the officer takes him down and uses force, and he ends up getting a head injury. He had a problem with his arm that was basically refractured. It was already not a healthy arm to begin with. And he's charged with resist, delay, and obstruct, which is kind of a catch-all for when an officer is frustrated with somebody and they took up too much of their time or they somehow interfered with the investigation, then they charge them with resist, delay, and obstruct. resist, delay, obstruct is kind of one of my it's kind of one of my pastimes, really. When I was in private practice, I would send letters to people who got the only charge, resisting arrest. And in my letter, I'd say, "Hi, see, you got to go to court in Durham for resisting arrest. I'll represent you for free." And I'd get these bizarre calls, like, "Really, seriously, is this a hoax?" I'm like, "No, really, this is like my public service." And it's a lot of fun because inevitably the officer has violated their rights. Inevitably the officer is trying to cover up their own misconduct by charging them with the only charge of resist, delay, and obstruct. And so I had a whole bunch of adventures that went with these resist, delay, and obstructs. Just amazing, fun trials. Half the time the officer doesn't show up to the resist, delay, and obstruct trial, and they kind of took their pound of flesh when they arrested the person and made them post bond. So when they do show up, my hope is that there is video so that we can see how poorly the officer behaved and how they really escalated the situation. When they do show up and we have a video, I've been 100% successful in getting the charges thrown out, dismissed, either at a suppression motion or as a not guilty. And then I use the video and the trial, because I record the trial in district court. There's no court reporter in district court, so I get my own recording. So from a 1983 or civil rights point of view, I'm getting a free deposition of the officer during the criminal defense trial, which is kind of like playing defense with an eye to getting good field position for offense. And so between the video and my recording of the officer's testimony, I can either use that in a civil action or I can bring it to my advocacy friends. And in this case, I brought it to the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Well, I'm working with the Southern Coalition and other folks trying to advocate for different behavior by the police. And we're asking for several things. But at this particular point in our movement, we're asking that for stops, officers have to do written consent in order to search, because we found that people of color were 11 times more likely to be asked to search their car at a routine traffic stop than white folks. And we just wanted a written consent. It's not required by the law, by Constitution, but we want it here because we think it will reduce the incident of consent searches where people are coerced into giving consent. So the video and the trial became a little documentary in the hands of the Southern Coalition that then they could use for policy purposes at the City Council to get them. Here's another example of why we need consent forms, and probably also better videos and better use of videos. And this was kind of dated because you'll see at the end of the video a little pitch for, call your City Council member. They're going to vote on this soon. And that actually did pass. That the Durham police actually voluntarily started implementing a consent search. So one of the things I like about this video is not only does it show video in work in terms of that was used in litigation, but it also shows you a video that was used in litigation and also for policy purposes. Another interesting thing about these cases is that when officers engage in misconduct, usually when they write the reports based on what they wish they had done and not what they actually did. And the way they're traumatized too in these situations. And so they try to start remembering things based on their training, and they will put things in their report that did not happen. And so when you have a video, like in this case, it became very easy for me to impeach the officer. Well, you said he attacked you, but he never got off the curb. He never stepped towards you. Isn't that true? Well, yeah. And the impeachment becomes very easy. And that's a pattern that I observe, is that the officer's written reports very often contradict the video because it's not, I think, the way they have experienced it. They're really writing down how they were trained and explaining what they should have done and not really what really happened. So without further ado, I'll show you John Hill.
I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm 58 years old, and I've been in Durham for approximately 6 years.
your testimony, you were too excited to hear Mr. Hill say multiple times, "I could not breathe." That's your testimony?
That's why I don't recall him saying that.
Well, we've been asked on the police search arrest for illegal search. Have you ever heard of search intent to arrest? No drugs, no drug paraphernalia, just a black man on his way to work.
Now, I can't speak for the legal analysis here on the search incident to arrest. I think this is more advocacy than it is maybe good law, but I didn't do that. It's not
I'm
me.
going to have to agree with you on that one.
Yeah, I think search
Students
incident to
take note,
arrest.
that actually probably was fine to look in his
Yeah.
backpack before they put the backpack in the police car.
Yeah, they want to make sure there's no something ticking in that bag before we take custody of it.
There is much inconsistency in what was testified to and what we saw in the video. Within really 60 seconds of this encounter, his arms being grabbed and he was slammed to the pavement.
Protection. You know, that's the bottom line. All I want is protection and to feel safe. But now I don't feel safe around a police officer because you don't know what you're going to get when you call them.
So that's John Hill. In the last year, there's been 153 charges of resisting arrest, when that was the only charge. Like, there's no other charge at all, not even like a stop sign violation. And of those 153 resist, delay, and obstruct charges, 90% were to people of color, even though Durham is more or less 50-50 in our racial composition. And so that raises really difficult questions for the police about their encounters with people of color and why folks are getting arrested for resist, delay, and obstruct. So that's enough for me. It's great. Oh, and John's going to love it that all y'all saw his video. I can't wait to tell him that so many eyes laid eyes on his video. So thank you all for watching.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Chris. I work for the ACLU of North Carolina. Thanks to the Duke Forum for Law and Social Change and the American Constitution Society for having us today for this important conversation. Obviously, thanks to Scott for bringing that video, which I think makes very real what the stakes that are involved here, and whether he knew it or not, very much tease up the comments that I wanted to make. And I think the key question I want to start with is, why are we having all of these conversations about body cameras? Why, for example, did Charlotte spend over $7 million recently to equip all of their officers with body cameras? Why did the legislature here in North Carolina put as part of the budget that there's going to be some matching state funds provided to localities, municipalities, counties who want to purchase body cameras? Why, as President Obama repeatedly talked about body cameras? And the answer, and I think the answer is important to start with because it informs how we develop a regulatory architecture to support body cameras, the answer are videos like that. And the answer is videos like we saw with Walter Scott being shot in North Charleston, Eric Garner in Staten Island, versus what transpired in Ferguson between Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, where we really don't know with 100% certainty what transpired between those individuals. The body cameras offer us at least some opportunity for further insight into fraught interactions between members of the public and law enforcement. I think, as Scott referenced, they oftentimes are a way of de-escalating circumstances, as folks on both sides of the camera probably tend to behave a little bit better when they know that they're being filmed in those circumstances. I think they are also an opportunity for further training within law enforcement agencies. When you see a circumstance where an officer is not acting appropriately, you can hopefully train up that officer, or, if necessary, get rid of an officer who repeatedly is not fulfilling his or her responsibilities. But so when you think about how this technology has been pitched to the public and to taxpayers who are paying, in Charlotte, $7 million, many millions more through the North Carolina state budget, this technology is not being pitched to the public as an evidence collection device. It's not being pitched to the public as another tool of surveillance, which sort of leads to, the fraught, being candid, interaction that the ACLU has with body cameras, right? So we are paranoid or whatever, and, sort of Minority Report, et cetera, concerned about these sorts of circumstances. So folks are always interested and perhaps confused when we state that we sort of support body cameras if they're supported by the correct regulatory architecture. But that's when body cameras are tools of accountability, tools of transparency, as opposed to tools of surveillance. So, what does it mean to create a regulatory architecture that allows these body cameras to be tools of transparency and accountability, as opposed to tools of surveillance? These are conversations we are having now with law enforcement agencies throughout the state, and Scott referred to a number of the key features that are really must-haves for these pieces of technology to live up to their stated goals. And I can't go through all of them, but I think there are a couple that are worth flagging. First, as this video made very plain, record the entire encounter from start to finish. And oftentimes there's some technology now that is available where the 60 seconds or 90 seconds before you press record on a body camera is also captured, as is the 60 or 90 seconds after you press stop recording on a body camera. That is really necessary to fully contextualize what occurs. And, when we think of even more terrible interaction between law enforcement and the public, the Walter Scott situation, you see a situation there where an officer, placed a taser on a gentleman who was dead and, handcuffed a corpse. And if you only start recording when we have a taser on the ground as opposed to seeing the entire interaction, then that's not particularly valuable. Second, you have to make sure that the body camera or the dash camera is fully equipped to be successful in all of its technological capabilities. You can't be shooting at a ridiculous angle where we're not seeing the entire interaction. You can't have a microphone that's left behind in a car. We're missing a lot of the interaction when that occurs. You need to ensure again, going to the video here, it just tees up everything. You need to ensure that all videos are retained, and not retained forever, such that, we have, again, going back to our paranoid function here for a second, that we have, some sort of database on all of my interactions or Scott's interactions with the Durham Police Department, but such that when these interactions occur, members of the public who do get captured on body cameras, have some ability to see all of what transpired so that they can seek some sort of redress when there's bad conduct that occurs. And sort of referenced it just there. Folks who are filmed captured in these interactions, Mr. Hill, other similarly situated individuals need to be able to access the body camera footage. If it is just going to be locked away in law enforcement vaults, even best case scenario there, that is only going to result in training and any sort of closed off bureaucracy. Handling training without some outside scrutiny is not going to do perfect training and is not going to really ask the hardest questions of itself, most likely. And then finally, there has to be robust public education about body cameras. And I think that features everything from having public forums where we talk about why we are putting these on the street, how we are putting these on the street, when they're going to go on the street. But then also something that we stress a great deal, and it doesn't, but the default has to be that members, that the police officers, the sheriff's deputies inform the individual that they're interacting with that they are recording them, so that there is that awareness. If you really think that these can be a tool of de-escalation in some circumstances, and there's some, albeit preliminary, but there is some good data that shows that these can have a de-escalating impact, resulting in fewer uses of force instances, but also fewer complaints about law enforcement. And if you believe that that can happen, there really does have to be a disclosure that recording is occurring so that you can avail yourself of that de-escalating possibility that goes along with the technology.
Great. So I'm Professor Daryl Miller. I teach civil rights litigation here at Duke. I don't have nearly the kind of depth of information about body cameras or recording these incidents. My experience is much like yours about watching it on TV, seeing how video has been used. In fact, I used to be at the University of Cincinnati, and there's a clip of a man being shot to death by a University of Cincinnati police officer that was caught on a body camera. I think I would maybe echo a little bit of what Chris said and highlight a little bit more why the idea of body cameras isn't totally an unalloyed good, and take some serious thought about whether we want to do it as a policy matter and under what conditions. So there's no doubt, at least in terms of some of the initial statistics, that the use of body cameras and recording these incidents leads to a decrease in officer use of force incidents, as well as reduction of citizen complaints. Now, there could be all kinds of confounding variables, right? It could be the body cameras. It could be just that, there was a dip in crime statistics or interactions. It could be all kinds of things. So I don't want to mislead you in terms of the robustness of the documentation, but that's some of the data that we have. There's some evidence, at least from the municipalities like Rialto, California, that have used body cameras in particular, that they're good in sort of evidence collection, making sure that a crime scene isn't tampered with or altered in some way. These are all the sort of pluses that we have with the use of body cameras in terms of a public policy environment. Some of the downsides Chris has talked about, but it really is the idea about, all right, do you videotape everything? What are the conditions under which you actually start the camera, or do you just simply have the camera running at all times? Because the important events didn't happen 20 seconds before the encounter, but actually happened 40 seconds before the encounter. So there's all kinds of really difficult line drawing issues with the use of cameras. There's all the privacy issues. There are some extremely sensitive types of events that having videotape evidence might actually be quite harmful to the person. Think a rape investigation, think of a mass shooting, and there are plenty of people that have no real interest in what good government or good policing is, and are just want to be spectators. And whether these things end up on YouTube and become a kind of meme that would actually only aggravate the kind of sense of degradation or fear or loss that somebody who had been the victim of a crime, even a passive victim, might feel if that kind of information was released. And that segues into issues about how long do you keep the information? How do you keep it secure? We live in an environment which sort of data hacking of various kinds occurs repeatedly, and not only in the emails, but to the extent that you had a storage of these police encounters, how would you keep that sort of data secure? The last thing I think that is an interesting point is the kind of soft skills that I think that we can imagine that it takes to be a police officer, right? Not every encounter is, is an encounter that involves the use of force. And what happens in terms of the incentives if everybody knows that everything's being recorded at all times? The issue about being let off with a warning, the sort of casual encounters that a person would have with a police officer asking them questions, that they might not want disclosed for whatever reason. These are the types of things that we would worry about, and I think in addition to the kind of Orwellian fear of cameras everywhere and everybody being recorded at all time, is that rather than sort of lowering the temperature, it would make police encounters hyper-technical, that there wouldn't be those kinds of opportunities for de-escalation, because everything's got to be done by the book, and when everything's done by the book, then everybody's attitude towards the situation is different. I mean, just imagine if everything that you were doing at all times here at Duke Law School was being recorded. Everything that I did was being recorded. I think we would have a sort of different dynamic in terms of all kinds of interactions, and there's no reason to think that interactions between the police and the community would be any different. And the final issue that I'll just put on the table that has been raised in some reports on this particular issue is, why stop at the police? There's all kinds of environments in which the citizenry interact with the state, whether we're talking about judicial proceedings or proceedings between principals and students. If the kind of incentives that we're trying to create, or trying to behavioral changes that we're trying to create through the use of recording to police officers operate in that environment, why is there any reason to think that the same thing couldn't be done in these other environments, which we might think of as being less hospitable to active and omnipresent recording?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming as well. So my comments would echo a lot of the things that have been said, and I'm happy to have Scott and Chris here and hope to yield much of my time for their insights. It's nice to hear from two different perspectives on the utility of body cameras, and it's also representative, I think, of how the stakeholders in this have all so uniformly agreed that this is a good advance, and it's important as well that Professor Miller has begun to highlight some of the unintended consequences and drawbacks that come with that as well. So from the ACLU's perspective, of course, there's a concern about privacy, and the regulatory piece of this has not yet been worked out in most jurisdictions. So how long you retain the footage, who has access to it, what happens when child abuse victims are interviewed, or rape victims, or when there's a domestic violence scenario. These are very deep intrusions that law enforcement is making into the intimacy of people's lives. And if everything is being recorded, the danger of the intrusion becoming worse because of the existence of the tape is very real. And the danger, of course, of voyeurs as well is very much there. Another unintended consequence that I'm glad that Professor Miller highlighted is that so law enforcement is happy to wear the body cameras, and by and large is glad to have them, in part because citizens are recording their encounters with law enforcement broadly already. And this is a challenge for law enforcement. It's created some very interesting public encounters and altercations between law enforcement and people trying to record their activities. And they would just as soon have their own recording of what's going on if other people are going to record and run that up to YouTube as quickly as they can. But it also means YouTube is not the only audience for this anymore, because now law enforcement supervisors are seeing those encounters as well. And the study that Professor Miller referenced, I think it's the same Rialto study, it definitely shows that there's less violence, there's a drop in arrests, there are fewer stops and frisks, there's less use of weapons. So there are many things that we are, would take as the ultimate goods, and we'll take all the unintended consequences that go with that. But one of the unintended consequences is more tickets. Is law enforcement knows that they're following protocols, they're reaching quotas, and when they're being recorded, they're less creative in the way that they encounter people. The soft skills that Professor Miller talked about are less evident, and they're doing everything in a very rote way when they encounter people in a sort of robotic sense. And so that's not necessarily all to the good. And the other thing that I wanted to say about the material that's come out so far is I think it would be helpful to separate the function of body cameras into ex ante and ex post categories. So the ex post category is very tricky for the reasons that we've already talked about. As far as evidence goes, as an evidence law matter, it's not that complicated. The body cameras are usually referred to as silent witnesses. They're like surveillance cameras in convenience stores when there's been a robbery or something. They're not hard to get admitted as long as they can be authenticated as functioning correctly and utilizing a perspective that more or less captures the whole scene. But the problem is that not everyone views the tapes the same way, and we saw this in the Eric Gardner case. We had footage of that, and it was certainly viewed with more uniformity than the Ferguson incident, but not total uniformity. So people are seeing these videotapes, and for a long time, there's been a project called the Cultural Cognition Project, which has looked at the way that courts and law enforcement and citizens react to videotaped encounters with law enforcement. And people come at those, they might see the exact same tape, and it might be a relatively comprehensive perspective on what occurred, but the way that people view what occurred is still informed by their own experiences and biases. And nothing about the existence of a videotape is going to change that. So as a piece of evidence, it has great utility. It's obviously affecting Scott's practice quite a bit. I'm intrigued by how important it has become to you. But it's also important to note that, like all other kinds of evidence, people are approaching it from their own vantage points. And even seeing a videotape does not create a uniform response as to whether, for example, that was a reasonable use of force by a police officer. I think its real promise is actually ex ante in the way that it affects how law enforcement interacts with the community. And there are the unintended consequences are important, and we need to think about the privacy issues, and we need to think about robotic use of protocols because of the recordings. But I think there's a discipline to being recorded when you encounter other people that is akin to reading something you've written out loud, in the sense that you see it through fresh eyes. And I think one of the biggest problems in the law enforcement community is an us versus them mentality, the sort of, the blue line, the blue wall, the sense that they are very removed from the communities that they serve culturally and logistically. They keep odd hours, they tend to socialize only with each other, sometimes multiple generations of a single family serve in law enforcement. They face real dangers every day on the job that most of us can't relate to, and they're very isolated in meaningful ways. And one of the things that's been costly as a result of that is empathy. They don't often succeed in seeing encounters the way that the people that they're addressing and potentially intimidating and maybe even physically harming are experiencing those encounters. And I think that knowing that they're being recorded is actually more promising than what is typically talked about, which is some version of having them, sympathize with what it's like to be in a disadvantaged community and encounter law enforcement. Those are important skills, but they ask a lot. I think it's easier to ask them to just try to see what they're doing through someone else's calmer perspective at a later time. And I think that the fact that law enforcement is so broadly wearing these body cameras now is just beginning to create these effects we've seen with a little less violence, a little less abusive stop and frisk type activity, because they have the discipline of knowing that what they're doing is going to be looked at from their perspective. What they see is going to be seen by someone else. And I think it is a little bit like reading your own writing out loud and thinking about being cautious with your words, and in the case of law enforcement, with your actions. And so that ex-ante effect strikes me as deeper and more promising in some ways than the evidentiary utility of the videos, which is important, but not hugely different from other kinds of evidence that we've had access to for quite a while.
Okay. So I'd like to give all of the panelists a chance to respond if you have any comments on what the other panelists have said. If not, I can open up the floor for questions.
So I think I would just, mention something that lots of people are probably familiar with. I am not a big social media person, but you can imagine, all the dynamics, both good and ill, that are created by social media and Twitter and all that kind of mess, right? Playing out exactly the same way with regard to video that's online with police encounters, right? The comment thread, sort of degenerating really quickly, but even worse, sort of, the sense of a kind of mob mentality on one side or the other of people that might not really have wanted to even be in this sort of interaction in which this one encounter with the police is suddenly fodder for everybody's opinion in a really direct way. The other thing to be, to sort of think about is, for people that have been in law enforcement, and some of you might end up being in law enforcement, not necessarily as police officers, but as prosecutors or working for the Department of Justice, is, everybody sort of assumes at some point that you get to take off the, you take off the badge and you get to take off the officer of the court and you get to go home and be a person again. And, the fact that, I think is some of the current concern, the fact that people that really are evil and want to do ill with regard to our society could make use of some of this information with all the other kinds of information that is publicly available can really be potentially quite hazardous. Now, does this mean that we end up with a society in which, like south of the border, or in Iraq, where the police officers, are obscuring their faces or wearing masks or something? No, but I think that it's something to consider when we talk about just how open a society we want with regard to this, and the incentives that it creates in terms of what we want and expect of law enforcement officials who are, at the end of the day, people too.
And so, I just think that amplify on some of the comments that were made about the privacy versus transparency equities, and equities that really matter a great deal to the ACLU. It's on some of those issues, they're really easy, at least policy solutions about what should be the rules of the road that are sort of broadly accepted. So, for example, both inside and outside of the department, body camera footage, dash cam footage should not be used to ridicule somebody, ridicule an officer for doing something wrong, but ridiculing somebody who's drunk and says, is being an ass. That should not be something that is uploaded to YouTube, and there's broad law enforcement agreement with us in regards to that. And then going to Professor Miller's point, there has to be some sort of technological way of ensuring that these videos, quite a bit of them, especially those that are retained for longer periods of time, are going to be extraordinarily sensitive or locked down. Those are the easy examples. The harder examples are the ones that are referenced by Professor Griffin. For example, the domestic violence phone call that police gets. Survivor of domestic violence calls. And I've been on panels with media attorneys who have said that that the body camera should be on, and that WRAL should be able to get access to that body camera footage, that they are approaching it entirely as a transparency tool without a countervailing, from my perspective, consideration of the real impact on the survivor's privacy, but also on the ability to stop domestic violence, because you're going to stop people from calling if they think that the price of picking up the phone and making that phone call is that they're going to have their picture in a terribly compromised and fraught situation on the News and Observer, the front page, or on the home page of WRAL. And so I've been criticized by media attorneys for saying that when we are capturing footage like that in private spaces, that the only person who should be able to access footage like that is the person who's actually being filmed. It should not be broadly available. Now, if Daryl and I, have some interaction with the police out in front of the law school on a public sidewalk, WRAL is going to be able to film that if they come along. They're not going to be able to follow the police into somebody's house. So that, to me, seems like a good rule of the road there. If WRAL would be allowed to be there, they should be able to access the footage, but they're not going to be able to go along with the police into somebody's house. But, and we've toyed around, and this is sort of underlying Professor Miller's point about the really difficult line drawing that's involved here, with saying that, in that domestic violence survivor example, that individual, or any individual who's being filmed in their home, should have the right to say, I'd like you to stop filming, and law enforcement to respect that right. And I'll tell you, we've gotten pushback from law enforcement in regards to that proposal. And the example that was provided to me was, and this was in Carborough, surprise, surprise, they were willing to talk to the ACLU. It's a local joke. Oh, y'all are Duke students. I'm a double Tar Heel, so I get to make fun of y'all now. But they said, there is a 250-pound, 6'4" autistic gentleman who lives in Carborough, lives with his parents, and we are called to their house all of the time. And we have exceptionally fraught interactions with them. And oftentimes the situation seems to have de-escalated, and then it just flares right back up. And we get accused of mismanaging the circumstance, and we see the body camera in that instance as a way to document that we're doing the right thing and push back against what we regard as frivolous complaints. So if we get a request from that family to quit recording, we don't want to quit recording. We understand their privacy interest. But if this is going to be a valuable tool in regards to, getting us and proving that we're doing the right thing in these instances, we can't just automatically defer to that request. So how you draw these lines in regards to the variety of interests involved is exceptionally complicated.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really interesting to hear so many different perspectives. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to open up the discussion. Does anyone have questions for any of our panelists? Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. This is really interesting. I do want to push back a little bit on Professor Miller's point about it kind of being a slippery slope in terms of what interactions we decide to record, because in interactions with police, there are people that wind up dead, and there's mysterious circumstances. And so that to me is a really bright line. You have interactions where people wind up dead, and then you have everything else.
What about emergency rooms? People wind up dead there too. Should we record those?
That's true. That's true.
A thought.
Well, so in emergency rooms, it's, I don't know anything about medicine, but
neither do I.
But it's a contained environment. There is some reason to believe that there is kind of sufficient other, like you were talking about, there's other evidentiary support, although you think that in a lot of situations there's other evidentiary support, which I think we've come to a place as a society where we're concerned that there is not enough evidentiary support in this case. And so of the interactions that we're concerned that there's not enough evidentiary support, where people wind up dead, it does seem to be limited to this one category.
But look, there's lots of interactions, right? Where I can imagine somebody saying, I can see where this is going to go. This is going to end up in a, one party says X happened and the other party says Y happened. And you know what? To prevent there be any mistake about what actually happened, I'm going to go ahead and videotape everything that happened in this interaction. And I mean, an interaction between the police officer and a person that they're encountering, a citizen on the street, is just one version of that, right? If we have an environment in which all kinds of interactions can give rise to all kinds of legal liability, and you are concerned about the evidence of one party says X happened and another party says Y happened, right? Then it seems like, the immediate solution is, well, let's just record it. Let's just have, then there's going to be no doubt as to actually what happened. And then we're running up against all kinds of not only line drawing, which is, why are some kinds of interactions that have to do with, police officers different than other types of interactions, like whether you're going to suspend a student, or even, what are we going to expel somebody from the state university, for example, for the underage drinking at the party, or all kinds of things that I can imagine that depend on a trade-off between knowing what happened for certain and the privacy implications that arise from it. And the other thing that came to mind, by the way, is, we're talking as if it was just the person and the person with the camera. But that's, I've got two girls, and I realize it's not me not giving them a cell phone with a camera, but it's the fact that all their friends have cell phones with cameras, right? So, imagine it's the privacy of interest of the people that don't even want, they're just bystanders. They don't even want to be there. The cops come and raid the party. They didn't know that, the coke deal was going down in the back, and now they're implicated in a coke ring. And nobody wants to be in that situation, and there's no control over that kind of stuff unless we put in ex-ante controls.
My thought about that, though, is that the reason we care about police is because we have a distrust of the police that goes back hundreds of years and falls along racial lines. That what makes the police different is that they have traditionally and historically treated people of color differently, and there's a deep level of distrust in communities of color who are feeling like they're occupied by the police and who have been beaten and shot and killed for hundreds of years. The only difference now is that we have video cameras in our phone and can document the incidents in a way that we couldn't before. Racial profiling was anecdotal until we got data collected at our state level and could show that folks of color are more likely to be stopped. These incidents were anecdotal until everybody's got a recording device. And what makes the police different is that they are the state, and they have guns, and we don't trust them anymore. And so because they will get on the stand and lie about how they treated this person of color, we need to have videos so that we can show that even their well-meaning lie, even if it's unconscious bias, or even if it's structural, is still not the truth. And the only way to account for that on the street, where people are getting beaten, where people are getting shot, there's no way that a Duke University officer would treat one of y'all the way they treated Mr. Hill. It just wouldn't happen. Go about your way. And the difference is race. That's the difference. And class. When we look at these videos and these resisting cases, I'll sit in the same office with the prosecutors, and they'll look at the John Hill video and they'll say, yep, see, he didn't sit down. This is evidence of guilt. And I'll look at the same video and say, that was your point. I say, no, that's evidence of excessive force. And then we both get all fired up and we go into court. And I happen to get a judge on this day who sees excessive force. I could have gotten a judge on a different day who has a different set of bias. But the answer to that is not stop recording. The answer is that have hard conversations about race. The answer to that is deal with those long threads on Facebook where people are just throwing stuff out and make it more participatory so people can have the conversations around truth and reconciliation around race that we haven't had in our history, even though we are a deeply racial society.
There's a famous case in which the Supreme Court justices all watched the same car chase and then disagreed about
Walter versus Scott, yeah. Yeah.
Scott versus Harris.
Scott
yeah.
versus Harris.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had a question about how you thought that strengthening some of the enforcement mechanisms for Brady might have an impact here, because one of the issues that I see in terms of having more police video is I don't know how relevant that is if Brady is still poorly enforced in various districts, or if, sort of depending prosecutor's office to prosecutor's office, and that kind of, if you have those sorts of violations in place, then there isn't an enforcement mechanism, sort of how you see that interaction playing out.
So the tricky issue there is partly regulatory, because the Brady requires that they turn over the exculpatory stuff that they're aware of. But there isn't a routine practice of going back and viewing videos in every single case. So if you can imagine thousands and thousands of hours of body cam footage that may or may not have captured a moment that may or may not be helpful to a defendant. So I absolutely agree with you that a lot of the stuff is going to be Brady, but that's a lingering issue as well, because that means somebody has to view and code all of those tapes and figure out whether or not to turn them over and to whom.
Can I just weigh in? So one of the interesting things about this, and this is a little bit in the future, but not that far, right? Which is something that I think it was Jeff Rosen had raised about, the fact that you've got a confluence of lots of images and recording, and also all kinds of search tools and facial recognition and that kind of thing that is actually really developing at an incredible pace. It's not unrealistic to think that in 30, 40 years, you could do something that would be very much like a DNA database, but it wouldn't be with DNA, it would be with all the images that are in the cloud, right? And then you'd basically have a face recognition that you'd go through, and you'd go through and be able to find where was X on a certain day when they said that they were, when the police said that they were somewhere, or they said that they were somewhere, were they really there? And, whether you think that is, if you're on the defense side, maybe that'll be really great because it can be exculpatory. If you're a little bit worried about the sort of sense in which you're sort of constantly, under surveillance, it's not necessarily something that you really feel comfortable with.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So, yes, Brooke.
To the point that we should avoid uploading videos just to humiliate people on either side, or privacy concerns, do you think that there would be some benefit to having a statutory ban on uploading police body videos to public video websites, or do you think that there's some benefit to having public access to these videos, for example in the Eric Garner case, where maybe there's raising of awareness, or maybe public outrage over things can cause some sort of social good? Do you think it would be better if there's no way that the public had access to these videos, or do you think that there's some argument for it?
I think for these to be worthwhile, that there has to be some sort of public access, because otherwise, if you say that these videos are only going to be utilized by law enforcement agencies, first, the only time we're ever going to, and they're going to have complete control over whether they get released, for example, the only time we're ever going to see body camera footage is when they're doing things in an undoubtedly appropriate fashion. We will never see footage when they've transgressed what their responsibilities were, or they're misbehaving. I think and furthermore, I think just the way structures work, when you have a closed system like a police department, nobody likes being second guessed, right? And that in hierarchical structures like law enforcement, which are probably even more predisposed to not like being second guessed, that's just a real recipe for only perhaps the most egregious videos or examples, and probably not, for example, one of the videos that we saw there, because you saw the chief's comments in regards to that. I think that struck all of us, and I presume most of us in this room, as being horrifyingly excessive. But the police chief, probably for a variety of reasons, one, predisposed to take a law enforcement side, but two, also as sort of the head of the hierarchical structure there, wants to tell his officers, I've got your back, right? And I don't want you to think that I'm going to sell you out the first time somebody asks questions. And if we just allow videos to only exist in that closed-off universe, only the most egregious examples are going to be subject to discipline. Only the absolute worst actors will ever be weeded out. There has to be some sort of public access to videos for them to come anywhere close to realizing some of the goals that we've talked about.
We actually have about 3 more minutes, so if there's anyone else with a question.
Well, I'll sort of half respond to it, which is, you mean, there's, one of the issues is sort of the, you know, is it a public document and sort of public records when you make these videos? Is there a right for the people to simply request it for any old reason, right? I just want to see what happened. And once that happens, right, whether it's released for, you know, under a FOIA request or it's just released as part of the public record in terms of the litigation or something, then it's there, right? Everybody here is familiar enough with the internet that once it's out there, it's not like you can, you know, put the genie back in the bottle, and then people will use it for whatever reason. They'll manipulate it, right? They'll put, you know, they'll make a song, they'll soundtrack to it, right? They'll do all kinds of crazy
Bad
stuff.
constitutional law.
Bad constitutional. They'll alter it, right? And then suddenly you got this sort of other meta conversation about what really happened. I saw this one that was on YouTube. Now I saw this other one. This is the real one. Now this one was the real one. And it's just the nature of sort of the information age that we live in.
And I'll say one more thing. We have a real mess of laws in regards to public access to things like body cameras. If anybody's interested in this, Freda Bluestein, who's a professor at the School of Government, has written about how accessible any of this footage is, and her take is that it's really generally not publicly available. That one, almost all of it would be not a public record because it's generally evidence of criminal investigation or criminal intelligence, which means it's not a public record, which means that, you know, municipality can turn it over but doesn't have to turn it over in response to a public record request. But even more problematically, and I think this is the way North Carolina deviates from a lot of other states in a real troubling fashion, personnel records are confidential. So almost, you know, her point is that almost anything interesting that is captured by a body camera about, for example, a law enforcement agent, would end up in his or her personnel file. And therefore, even if Durham wanted to release that footage, they could not, because it is locked away per statute. That's something that there has to be a legislative fix in regard to.
I had a hilarious version of that where my guy got beat up at the BP station, and the video from the BP station caught the officer broke the officer patrol rear view mirror, the side view mirror, that broke his own mirror with my guy's head and then charged my guy with damaging personal property. And there was the video was on the BP, and when I tried to go request it, they said that it had become part of the personnel file for the officer's investigation, and therefore they were not allowed to disclose it under, and BP had already destroyed it, so they had, the only copy was in the personnel file, which requires litigation then to go get it in, under protective order.
Well, I think we are out of time, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to all of the panelists. It was a great discussion.